Crazy spider went up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out.
This story takes place when I was 8 years old, in 2006 in Tampa, Florida. I was walking from a friend's house, who lived just a few streets over. This was only about 2 weeks after my mum had finally thought I was responsible enough to go to my friend's house without her having to walk me there. It was about 6 p.m. It wasn't dark as it was during the summer months. I came to a road which I had to cross to get to my house. It was a residential street, so it wasn't busy. However, there was a car coming, so I had to wait to cross. I noticed that the car was slowing down. At first I thought the driver was allowing me to cross, but then suddenly accelerated, which I thought was strange, but my 8-year-old self didn't think anything of it. The driver then rolled down his window. He was a slim, middle-aged man. He didn't look creepy or strange, just an ordinary person. He shot me a smile and said, "Hey kid, your mum asked me to pick you up." I stood there clueless as I didn't recognize this man. Besides, my house was just around the corner and would only take me a few minutes to walk. He noticed that I was unsure. He shot another smile at me and said,
"Yep, 89 on 47th Street.
in a sort of reassuring tone of voice. That was my address, but I was still unsure about the whole scenario, as I thought it was strange. I was getting nervous as I was told to never speak to strangers, and I was breaking that very rule. "How do you know my mum?" I managed to whisper to the man.
I'm a work friend."
He said in a more assertive tone of voice. I suddenly went into panic mode as my mum didn't have a job. I stood stiff. I was too scared to do anything. My heart was pounding and I just hoped that someone would just help me. He opened his car door and walked towards me, took my hand and walked me to the back seat of his car. This seems crazy that I'd just let this stranger take my hand and walk me to his car, but I was literally paralyzed with fear. "Buckle up," he said in a friendly tone of voice, and he sat in the driver's seat putting the car into gear. As he started to drive, I felt relieved as I noticed he was going in the direction of my house. I was so relieved that I forgot about him saying that he was my mum's work friend. However, panic started to set in once we passed my house, with no sign of stopping. You've passed my house?" I mumbled as I looked at him through his mirror. He looked back at me but didn't say anything. "You've passed my house?" I said louder, thinking he hadn't heard me, but he just stayed silent. This was the most scared I've ever been as we got further and further away from my house. I vividly remember passing my grandma's house, who only lived a few streets over. She was standing out on her garden talking to her neighbour, and I just wished that she had saw me and could have helped me. I started to sob silently as we got further and further away from my neighbourhood. Now it had been about 15 minutes on the road with this man. "Where are we going?" I mumbled. No answer. We got joined to the interstate. I remember seeing people in their cars on the streets and just wishing they could help me. We then came to a red light at a crossroad. A car pulled up next to us, obviously waiting at the red light. I looked at the driver and she noticed me. I knew that this was my chance. She could help me. I was too scared to do anything but just stare. She smiled and waved at me and turned back to the road in front of her. I knew that my chances were gone. Nobody would help me and I'd never see my mum ever again. I knew that she would start to get worried soon as we had been on the road for a good 20 minutes after she expected me home. I looked at the man again through the mirror. He noticed me looking at him and smiled once again. The light changed to green. The woman turned to the crossroads, but we went straight. We got to another crossroad and the lights were red. Once again, I knew this was my only chance to help myself, and that there might not be another opportunity. A car pulled up beside us. Inside was an elderly couple. I was staring at them, but they weren't looking at me. My heart started to beat even faster. Tears started to stream down my face as I was so desperate for them to see me, but they weren't looking. Suddenly, the elderly lady who was driving looked across, but not at me. By this time, I was intensely staring, hoping they'd see me. By my delight, the elderly lady's eyes drifted to the back seat of her car, but noticed me on the way. She smiled cheerfully. Fear rushed inside me as I mouthed the words, "Help me." I clearly remember the woman's face turned to shock as she swiftly turned to face her husband. The lights then turned green, and we set off again. I was praying that she understood what I was saying, and that she would call for help. About 10 minutes passed as we drove down the interstate, when I heard sirens coming from behind us. I looked into the mirror of the car again. I could see that the man had a nervous facial expression. The sirens became louder and louder. I didn't think the man was going to stop, but as he noticed that the cops were pulling him over, he said to me, "You are my nephew, I am your uncle, is that clear?" in an aggressive but scared tone of voice. I nodded as the car came to a complete stop. Everything was silent for what seemed like hours, but in reality it was only about 5 seconds. Suddenly, I heard people yelling, "Come out of your car with your hands to your head." Then I noticed cops surrounding the car with guns drawn. The man opened the door casually. As he did, this cop tackled him to the ground, yelling at him while putting him in handcuffs. On the other side, a cop opened the door and was reassuring me that everything was going to be okay, as he took me into the back of his police car and drove me back to my home. I expected my mum to yell at me for getting into a stranger's car, but she ran down the steps of my house and hugged me. The man was sentenced to 10 years in prison for multiple counts of attempted kidnapping. After that day, I never talked to a stranger again.
My parents had bought a house when I was 10 years old after living in an apartment since I was born. I was so excited. It was right near the school. My friends all lived within relatively close range, and summer had just started. It was perfect. We moved our things in over the course of about 2 weeks before we finally moved in. After ordering pizza and playing games to celebrate our first night in the new house, it was time for bed. Being 10 years old, I had severely underestimated how creeped out I would be living in a whole new environment. When I first laid down, I could have sworn I saw a silhouette of a man outside my window, but upon closer inspection there was nothing. Nonetheless, I fell asleep rather quickly. I was awoken at around 2 a.m. by a loud thud that came from under my room. Of course, this scared me so much I couldn't even get to my parents to alert them. I sat in my bed as I listened to the scratching noise that seemed to be coming from the floor itself, and the sound of things being moved around. I eventually rationalized that it was my father down there organizing some things, and just reasoned away the fact that it was so late. The noises went on for about another hour before abruptly stopping around 6 a.m. I went back to sleep until 7:30. The following morning over breakfast, I asked what my parents were doing downstairs in the middle of the night. They looked at each other and said they had no idea what I was talking about. I let it go and I figured I must have been dreaming. Even so, my dad checked the basement and didn't find anything strange, which helped put me at ease. My dad left for work and I stayed home for the day with my mom. Together we went into the basement and organized some of the many boxes we had thrown down there during the move. Everything went fine and we eventually left to go out to lunch. My dad got home from work and we ate dinner, all watched some TV together, and eventually went to bed. At about 11 p.m., I heard the sound of things moving around down there, then scratching again. This time, it was even louder than the night before. I turned and put my face to the wall, trying to fall asleep over the noise. After about 10 minutes, the scratching stopped, and what sounded like random fumbling could be heard. and it sounded like it was coming from inside my room. I was absolutely terrified. I suddenly felt a pair of hands grab me on my upper shoulder and my thigh, and squeeze tight, as if trying to get a grip to pull me away. Just then, my father burst in my room asking what the hell I was doing in there that was causing so much noise. I felt the vice-like grips release from my arm and leg, and I tried turning around. For literally a split second, I saw two features, bright green eyes and a big smile. It disappeared from my sight, and I heard things move below me. My father yelled louder than I'd ever heard him before, and grabbed me out of my bed. He basically tossed me in the room with my mother and closed the door behind him. I remember not knowing what was going on. I just remember being more scared than I'd ever thought possible. Eventually, the police came and asked me more questions than I'd ever been asked before. Apparently, someone gained access to our basement through a window with a broken lock. He had spent the prior 2 nights cutting and sawing through the floor of my room next to my bed. And once he made his way through, he attempted to grab me from my bed, where he would presumably take me to the basement, out through the window. First night, my parents must have been simply in too deep of a sleep to have heard any of the cutting. The second night, my dad was still awake reading when it all began. He got fed up with the noise and was coming into my room to yell at me for not being in bed, but instead saw the back of the top of half of a man with dirty ratty hair and tattered tuxedo with his hands on me. As soon as my dad stepped foot in the room, the man let go of me and dropped back into the basement, never to be seen again. The next day, we packed up our belongings and moved across town. My parents decided that after such a traumatizing event, there was no way we were staying in that house anymore, and I don't blame them. I often wonder if they caught the man who tried to take me. I wonder if he was ever successful. I wonder who he was and what he would have done to me if he was successful that time.